hope everyone had their coffee. So there are handouts up here. People probably have them. You can come up and grab one if you want it. One of the most striking things about Capital is the intelligence, wit, and breadth of knowledge that Marx possessed. The text is crammed with references and allusions to mythology, literature, philosophy, and the physical sciences. And all of that makes it a very engaging, funny, and profound read. If I accomplish nothing else in my presentation, at the very least I hope to convince you to read Capital yourself and really take the time and effort to understand it. I intend to introduce the major concepts of Capital. Each of them would require a 40-minute presentation of its own to develop in any detail. So all I can give you is a sneak preview, without much of the dynamics and the texture and the secondary considerations that Marx painstakingly develops. This is what Marx said about Capital. He said, "With the exception of the section on the form of value, this volume cannot stand accused on the score of difficulty. I assume, of course, a reader who is willing to learn something new and therefore to think for himself. You'll have to put real effort into grasping the concepts, particularly the dialectical exposition of this theory of value. But your efforts will be rewarded. Reading this book will literally make you smarter. It will open your mind to new methods of thinking and analysis, honestly. You'll get a clear and profound explanation of the dynamics of the capitalist economic system, better than most any college economics course will give you. And Marx constantly relates his analysis to actual developments, so you get a wonderfully detailed picture of the establishment of capitalism, particularly in England. When I refer to Capital, I mean Capital Volume 1, which was published in 1867 in German. Volume 1 analyzes capitalism from the standpoint of production. Volumes 2 and 3 take the standpoint of circulation and distribution and crises. And they were eventually published, but not in Marx's lifetime, and not with his kind of final review. Capitalism is in part a response to, Capital is in part a response to and critique of the leading economic theories of Marx's time, called political economy. Today, political economy is generally known as classical economics. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, John Stuart Mill. These were some of the first theorists and proponents of capitalism, the system that was emerging out of and against feudalism. Feudalism based itself on hereditary rights and laws that allowed the nobility to live luxurious lives at the expense of their serfs, who were bound to them. The classical economists sought to explain how the new capitalist system, based on a free market where every individual sought their own gain, would lead to a better life for everyone, an unceasing growth of social prosperity guided by the hidden hand of the market. Now, of course, Marx saw capitalism differently, and he critiques the shortcomings of the classical economists. But throughout Capital, you'll see that he draws on and respects their work in a serious way. There are a wide variety of surface phenomena, things in our day-to-day lives, forms of appearance, as they're called, that conceal the inner workings and laws of capitalist production. And I want to start with an analogy from science. When you stand on the surface of the earth, it appears that the sun rises in the eastern sky, traces an arc high over the sky, and sets in the west. It appears that the sun circles the earth. I'll give you a few more examples from the social and economic realm. We all use money and buy commodities every day, and we're very familiar with the world of prices, like a loaf of bread and a dozen eggs seem to have about the same price. But what do prices in money really represent? Another example, some of us are paid an hourly wage. That is, for every hour we work, we get some amount of money from our boss. It seems like we get an honest day's wage for an honest day's work. It appears that we are justly compensated for every hour of labor, right? It's kind of what it looks like. Most workers voluntarily agree to work for their employer. So it appears that the labor market is a free market, that each individual freely contracts with whoever their boss is going to be. So we have the appearance of free labor, of capitalists and workers meeting each other as equals in the labor market. Marx seeks to penetrate the appearances to discover the underlying laws of motion. This does not mean that appearances are fake or unimportant or not real. Money is a very real thing. Free labor is different than serfdom or slavery. But in order to have a complete analysis of capitalism, you must get beyond appearances to find the inner workings. And then based on those inner laws, you must account for and explain the real day-to-day appearances. Back to the analogy of the sun, astronomers had to collect and analyze observations of the sun and the planets and the stars in order to deduce the orbits of the solar system, in order to then truly understand why the sun traces an arc in the sky the way it does. That being said, Capital is not a book of numbers and formulas. It has both, but what it's really about is the social relations of production, the social relations of capitalism, the relations of production, and their dynamics. Now, capitalism in its full reality has far too many variables at play simultaneously, to actually be able to penetrate through that all. So Marx begins with a simplified model of capitalism, but one that has many of the assumptions of classical economy baked right in. So in order to critique, expose, and move beyond classical economy, he says, let's just say capitalism works the way that you ideally say it should, and as many modern-day libertarians would say that it should. Free and smoothly functioning markets where workers contract freely with their employers. Commodities are exchanged for their equivalents. You get what you pay for. No one's cheating anyone else. Of course, the real development of capitalism violates all of these assumptions and important aspects. And Marx discusses this. But in the main, he sticks to the model of classical economy to show that even on its own terms, capitalism is founded on exploitation and has contradictory tendencies. So that's enough of an introduction, and I want to just kind of start with the first concept here, the value, the labor theory of value. He begins with something familiar to all of us, that society's wealth appears as an immense collection of commodities. But what is a commodity? You can kind of follow along at the top of the handout. I mean, it's very rough. These are just conceptual things. So Marx poses that any commodity has a twofold nature. It has some sort of useful quality, which makes it a use value. A use value satisfies some human need or want or useful purpose, even if that want is socially constructed. So we're not just talking about food and water and shelter. Shoes help protect your feet. A hammer can be used to strike blows on various objects. Bread nourishes the body. This use value of a commodity is bound up with the actual physical properties, the molecular composition, the shape, in short, the material form of the commodity. Commodities have a second characteristic as well. They can be exchanged for other commodities in some ratio. Now, if we can exchange some quantity of bread for some quantity of shoes, there must be some common element of equal magnitude that exists in both things. Bread and shoes don't trade with each other on the basis of physical properties like color or weight or volume. There's some other element, independent of the physical properties of each commodity, that form the basis of their exchange value. So what do commodities have in common? They are products of human labor. And the labor itself has a twofold nature, a quantitative and a qualitative aspect. I'll start with the qualitative aspect. It has a specific concrete characteristic, a specific skill applied to specific raw materials to shape them into a useful form. Marx calls this useful or concrete labor. So for example, tailoring is very different than shoemaking in its concrete aspects. They're totally different processes. In an exchange relationship, however, two commodities are made to be equal to each other and replaceable by each other. So all of their specific characteristics, their use values, must fall away. And we are left looking at their exchange values. In a similar fashion, in exchange, all of the specific qualitative characteristics of the labor that produced the commodities falls away. And all that is left now is the quantitative aspect. How long was the labor performed? How many hours? Now, it still must be a use value, a useful thing, in order to exchange with other useful things. But the ratio of exchange is based on how much socially necessary labor time is embedded in the commodity. Socially necessary labor time is this concept that contains two ideas here. It's that the labor embodied in the commodity, one, must make something useful that other people want, and two, must be the average time required according to the prevailing technology and skills and intensity of labor. So if you want to make a little addition on your handout, this statement here where it says the substance of value is abstract human labor, you can put a little caret there and say socially necessary abstract human labor. This is in essence the labor theory of value. Whenever you see the word value alone, it refers to exchange value. This value, this labor time, is external to the commodity's use value, external to the commodity's physical being. Now, socially necessary labor time contains within it this contradiction between the use value, which is bound up with the physical aspects of the commodity, and the exchange value, which is not bound up with those physical aspects. But if these two poles become too disconnected and move too independently of each other, Marx posits that a contradiction can develop and a crisis can emerge. And what he's doing here is he's kind of setting up the crisis of overproduction. People, you'll read about that later, or maybe you've already heard about it. But in essence, Marx argues that exchange value is a social construction, particular to the way society is organized under capitalism. That doesn't mean that it's fake or that it's an illusion. Exchange value is a real thing, a real social relationship under capitalism, but it is independent of the physical properties of the commodity. If you're just looking at a hammer by itself, in isolation, you can't tell what its value is. You have to put it into an exchange relationship with other commodities, which is a social process. And the same hammer, at different times, will exchange in different ratios with other commodities. So its exchange value appears to change for the same use value. Marx goes on to argue that out of widespread commodity exchange with a large market and a wide variety of commodities, there emerges one commodity that acts as the universal embodiment of exchange value, the way to easily measure the value of any other commodity, and that is money. For example, gold used to act as money in earlier times. The price of a commodity is the amount of money whose exchange value is equal to the exchange value of that commodity. And there's a simple example here on the sheet. If a pair of shoes embodies 10 hours of socially necessary labor time, and if it takes 20 hours to produce an ounce of gold, then the price of a pair of shoes is half an ounce of gold. That's how that works. But anyways, if you walk into a supermarket, there's a dazzling array of products, all with their own prices, which seem to indicate that they all have different values relative to each other. The fact that a bag of chips costs $2.50 seems like something inherent to the chips. They're worth $2.50, even though it's not connected with any physical properties of the chips itself. These price relationships between commodities seem to get established, and they seem to change in a way that is completely independent of the people who make it or the people who buy it. And this is the fetish of the commodity, as Marx called it. By fetish, Marx didn't mean an unusual attraction to something the way it's kind of commonly used today. He meant it in the religious or mystical sense, the attribution of supernatural or mystical qualities or powers to an object. And by this he means this fantastical attribute, exchange value, which has, quote, absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity, yet which has very real social significance and power.